A while back, I found this glass jar meant for food storage, and I knew I had to get it. I had such a good terrarium project in mind for it. So, if you stay with me for this build, you'll see how I turn this boring glass jar into this beautiful rocky mountain-sized terrarium. So, let's get right into it. I started off by sanding down the base, so that the waterproofing I had in mind would adhere properly to it. To waterproof it, I'm using leak seal, which is meant for waterproofing roofs, but I think it should do the job here. I'm thoroughly coating the base with 2 coats, so that no water came in contact with it, as to prevent it from splitting in the future. I then left it to cure overnight. Once it had cured, I moved on to making the reservoir. I decided that expanding foam would be most suitable for this, as it would give me a good place to mount the rock later on. I simply covered the base so that I could have freedom when carving it, and I left to expand fully for a few hours. When it was fully expanded, I began carving by first trimming off the excess edges and cleaning the sides up. I proceeded to cut the top off the foam, and I also made sure to add some variation to the height, as to break it up and make it seem more natural. I cut the centre out the circle and removed as much of the expanding foam, leaving just the border. At this point, I was left with a base that was functional but didn't look aesthetically pleasing. To try and hide it, I decided to apply hot glue to the foam, which should waterproof it, and then cover it with sand. I was contemplating using silicone, however I wasn't sure if the sand would adhere to it properly. I repeated this process for the entirety of the foam. Now that the base is finally constructed, I can finally move on to the inside. I'm going to start with the hardscape and then moving on to planting it. Now, the base isn't the prettiest looking thing, but I'm hoping that by the end of it I should have concealed it enough that I'm okay with it. To create the main structure, I'm going to be using dragonstone. However, a lot of these pieces are a little too large, so I'm going to have to break them up outside. I broke the dragonstone down into smaller chunks that I liked, and made sure to collect as much of the dust and debris as possible, so that it could be used to conceal imperfections later on. I brought it all inside and chose a large piece that fit inside the glass, and began trying to find pieces that helped support and complement it. Once I had obtained a composition I was happy with, I used superglue and cotton wool to secure them, attaching superglue to the contact points and filling voids that needed more support with some wool, and adding more glue, which caused it to cure and bond immediately. When working with dragonstone, I find it's very important to make sure you go with the natural striations of the rock, as it's very linear and this will help make it seem even more natural. I then applied some of the leftover dust to conceal the superglue and to make the structure seem seamless. I then repeated this process until my desired shape was achieved. I then moved on to attaching it. I chose to use expanding foam again, as I felt superglue would not be strong enough here. At this point, I also decided that a small water feature would really complement this scape, and so I sealed off the area under the overhang of the rock to create a mini pond. This time, I didn't let it fully expand, and I peeled off excess from the sides and pressed down the foam under to stop it from expanding anymore. To conceal the main piece of foam, I used small chunks of dragon rock, positioning them into an orientation that I liked before supergluing them into place. I also applied some superglue to the foam marks on the sides before concealing it with more of the dragonstone powder to try and blend the base and the rock together. Now, I quite like this, but I think it's missing a little something, so I'm going to be adding some wood. It's got a lot of figure and I think it should really complement the dragonstone. I started off by attaching thicker pieces, having them create more variation in the scape. I again attached them using superglue and sprinkling powder on to disguise it. The next day, I went back with some smaller ivy that I'd found, which I thought really complemented it, twisting through and around the scape. I proceeded to add some of my substrate into the planting pocket behind the scape, pushing it in with the end of a paintbrush. Once this was done, I could start the planting process. I began by threading some spearmint through the back of the rock and having it peeking out the side. I then added some peppermint that had smaller rounder leaves for more textural contrast. I also planted a small water mint lower down on the right, just above the water feature. Common yarrow was added next, as its very fine longish leaves should really help tie everything together, and sphagnum moss was placed around the roots to help retain moisture. More was added winding around the rocks to the side. I'm not too sure what plant this is. I suspect it might be a type of wart, but anyway, I pressed it into the cracks to try and contrast the longer leaf mosses that would be planted next. Like always, sphagnum moss was added first, and then I began planting. I used fern moss and some swan neck thyme moss to conceal any sphagnum moss, soil, or any big voids. I'm not too sure how yarrow will do in a terrarium setup, however I think it's worth giving it a go, so I'll know for future projects whether it's worth trying again. I also used a little bit of pillow moss behind the scape to fill in the soil section. Now, I was happy with how it was planted, but it needed something else, and as there's no setup with water is complete without any floating plants, I added some. I had to keep it small, so I added some water fern, giant duckweed, which surprisingly isn't that large, and of course some much smaller normal duckweed. I'm happy now with how it's planted, but I think it needs something a little extra. So for that, I've got some millipedes and also some tropical orange isopods, which I think should really bring this setup to life. As I mentioned before, this scape needed some life. The millipedes are just some that I collected from my local area, but I think this should really help make it feel more alive. As for the isopods, they are from a small colony which I unboxed here. I'm not adding any springtails because the substrate I used already contains some, and these mosses are from my quarantine boxes which are full of springtails, so they should have some already on them. One thing I do need to mention however is that every few days I will be opening the terrarium just to let some fresh air in and to make sure the isopods and millipedes are fed. Now that the build is finally complete, I'm really happy with how it turned out. Originally, I thought I wouldn't be a fan of the base, but now I think it really helps frame the rest of the build. I'm looking forward to see how it grows and develops in the future, so if you want to stay tuned with this channel, please consider subscribing. Anyway, that's all for today, so thank you for watching and goodbye!